My name is Margaret Allen, and I am 72 years old. But I swear to you that tonight I feel like a child again. A frightened child who has just realized the people she trusted most in this world. The children she carried in her body, the daughter she raised, the son she sacrificed everything for, and even the partners they married into this family have turned into strangers. Wolves in familiar clothing circling around me, waiting for the perfect moment to rip apart what little I have left, and I beg you before I tell you what they have done, please, if you are listening to me, subscribe to this channel, leave a comment below, and let the world know if you have ever felt betrayed by your own blood. Because the only thing that gives me strength to speak through these tears is knowing that someone out there might hear my voice and remind me that I am not as alone as I feel in this moment, because today, as I sat at my own kitchen table, with the lace tablecloth my late husband Harold loved so much, I overheard my daughter Melissa whispering to my daughter-in-law, Patricia, not realizing that I was just outside the door. It's about time Mom signs the deed over. She's not going to last forever, and we can sell this place and split the money. And my heart dropped so violently I had to press a hand against the wall to stop from falling, because this house isn't just bricks and wood, it's the last piece of Harold's legacy. The home we built together 50 years ago with sweat, with overtime shifts at the factory, with dinners of beans and rice so we could make the mortgage, and to hear my own flesh and blood talk about it like it was a prize waiting to be carved. Up was a wound I can hardly describe, and when I pushed the door open, my hands trembling, my eyes wet, they froze, Melissa's eyes darting away, Patricia's mouth curling into that half smirk she always gives me when she thinks I'm too old and too weak to notice the venom beneath her politeness. And before I could even ask them why they would say something so cruel, my son Robert walked in from the living room, his voice sharp. "Mom, you weren't supposed to hear that. But it's true. It's time you start thinking about the future, about what's practical. You don't need this big house. You don't even use half of it anymore." And his words felt like knives because it wasn't concern I heard. It was greed. The kind that twists a person's face into something unrecognizable. And I told them with what voice I had left, "This is my home. I will not be pushed out." But then Patricia, bold as brass, slammed her coffee mug on the table and sneered, "You can't stop us forever, Margaret. Once you're gone, it's ours, whether you like it or not." And Melissa, my baby girl, nodded in agreement like a stranger, and I stood there shaking, remembering how I held that girl through scarlet fever, how I worked double shifts at the diner to buy Robert his first car, how Harold and I missed vacations, new clothes, everything, just to give them more. And this was the gratitude. This was the love, to be spoken of like a burden, like an obstacle to their payday. And as I sat down in my chair, the chair Harold had carved himself, I realized that my battle was no longer about comfort or dignity. It was about survival, about making sure that the wolves circling me did not take what was never theirs to begin with, because if they could look me in the eye and plot to strip me of my home while I still breathe, then what else might they be capable of? And the tears rolled down my cheeks as I whispered to Harold's picture on the wall, "They think I'm weak, but they've forgotten whose wife I was, whose blood runs through me. They've forgotten I still have fight left." And deep inside, past the pain and the betrayal, a fire sparked, small but steady, the kind of fire that had carried me through every storm of my life. And though my voice trembles now as I tell you this, know that I will not let their greed erase my history. And by the time this story is done, you will understand why sometimes it is the quietest old woman in the room who holds the sharpest blade of justice. The morning after that cruel conversation, I woke with eyes swollen from crying, my pillow damp with tears that seemed to have poured out of me long after sleep should have silenced my grief. And as I sat at the edge of my bed with the quilt Harold's mother had stitched for our wedding wrapped around my shoulders, I prayed for strength, though I knew prayers alone would not protect me from the children I once thought incapable of cruelty, because already I could feel their urgency pressing in like storm clouds gathering. And sure enough, by mid-afternoon, Melissa came back to the house, not with tenderness or apology, but with a man in a crisp suit carrying a leather briefcase, and she had the gall to introduce him as Mr. Harris, a financial advisor, though I could smell lawyer on him the way a farmer smells rain before it falls. And I knew right then that this wasn't a visit. It was an ambush, and Melissa's voice dripped with fake sweetness as she said, "Mom, we've been thinking it would be easier for you if the house was transferred to us now so we can handle the maintenance, the taxes, all those things that are too much for you at your age." And I stared at her, my daughter, the same girl I once watched take her first steps across this very living room floor, now standing there rehearsing lines like an actress reading from a script someone else had written. And I whispered, "Melissa, don't do this." But she only pushed the papers across the table, her eyes darting toward Mr. Harris, who smiled a lawyer's smile, thin and sharp. "Mrs. Allen, it's just standard procedure. Simply sign here and you won't have to worry about a thing." And my heart thudded because for a moment I saw my trembling hand, fragile and wrinkled, hovering above the pen, the temptation of peace calling to me, to just give in, to make the conflict stop. But then Harold's voice echoed in my memory. That steady rumble I once leaned on telling me, "Never let anyone take what you've built unless you're ready to give it freely." And I slammed my hand flat on the papers, the sound startling even myself, and I said, "No, not today, not ever." My voice shaking but firm, and Melissa's face twisted, anger surfacing beneath the mask. "Mom, you don't understand. This is for your own good. You can't live here forever. The stairs are dangerous. The house is too big. You'll thank us later." But I leaned forward, my tears hot and my throat raw. "Do you hear yourself, Melissa? You sound like a vulture circling a meal that hasn't died yet, and I am not dead. I am still here." And the lawyer cleared his throat uncomfortably, gathering his papers while Melissa's face burned red with fury. And as she stormed out, she spat words that pierced deeper than any knife. "Fine, but don't come crying to me when you fall down those stairs and break your hip. Maybe then you'll wish you had listened." And the door slammed behind her, leaving the house trembling like my heart, and I collapsed against Harold's chair, sobbing so hard I thought I'd choke. Because how could she say that to me, her mother, her only living parent? But as the sobs finally quieted into shaky breaths, I remembered what my neighbor, sweet old Clara, once told me after her own children tried to bully her into a nursing home for her life insurance. "Protect yourself, Margaret, because the law won't always protect mothers when their children turn into predators." And those words sank into me like anchors, steadying me. And I knew then that I had to stop being just a grieving widow and start being a strategist, because Melissa and Robert and their spouses weren't going to stop. They were circling for the kill. And if I didn't act now, I might lose everything Harold and I had worked for. So I wiped my tears, pulled out the worn address book Harold had kept in the kitchen drawer, and found the number of Mr. Charles Whitman, the attorney Harold once trusted for his will, a man who had shaken Harold's hand with the promise, "If anyone ever comes for this house, I'll make sure your wife is safe." And though my hands trembled dialing the number, when his familiar deep voice answered, I said with more strength than I felt, "Charles, it's Margaret Allen, and I think it's time I cash in that promise." And as I spoke those words, a strange calm settled over me, because for the first time since the betrayal began, I realized I wasn't entirely powerless. I had tools, I had my mind, and above all, I had the will to fight, even if it meant fighting the very children I once would have laid down my life to protect. 2 weeks later, just when I thought the storm might have passed and that maybe my children had realized how wrong they were, the knock came at the door that rattled my bones like thunder. And when I opened it, there stood Robert and Patricia, side by side like prosecutors ready to make their case, and behind them, a social worker I had never seen before, a young woman with a clipboard and a look that was supposed to be kind, but couldn't hide the condescension in her eyes. And before I could even gather my thoughts, Patricia swept into my living room without asking, her perfume clouding the air, her voice sharp and rehearsed as she announced, "Mom, we've had to call in some help because it's clear you can't keep living like this." And Robert crossed his arms with that same smug tilt of his chin that used to make teachers call him cocky in high school, saying, "It's for your safety, Mom. The house is too big. You forget things. You're getting confused and you don't take care of yourself anymore." And I stood frozen, my heart pounding as the social worker, who introduced herself as Miss Bennett, began looking around my living room as if she were inspecting a crime scene, scribbling notes while her eyes lingered on the family photographs, the worn carpet, the dishes still drying in the rack, and I wanted to scream that I wasn't some helpless old woman, that I still cooked my own meals, balanced my checkbook, drove my car to church every Sunday. But before I could open my mouth, Patricia chimed in with that venom wrapped in honey tone. Margaret, we've noticed you forget conversations, you've been emotional, crying a lot, and we're worried you're not capable of managing things anymore. And Robert added with a fake sigh. It's not just about the house, Mom. It's about your health. What if you fall? What if you leave the stove on? What if you hurt yourself? We're just trying to protect you. And those words, protect you, rang in my ears like a curse, because I knew what they meant wasn't protection at all, but power. Power to control me, to declare me incompetent, and to snatch away not just my home, but every ounce of dignity I still carried, and with every word they spoke, I felt Harold's presence stirring in my chest, reminding me of the strength he always said I carried, even when I doubted it. So I straightened my back, wiped my tears before they could see them, and turned to the social worker with as steady a voice as I could muster. Miss Bennett, I appreciate your concern, but I am not incompetent. I pay my bills on time. I maintain my home. I cook my own meals. And I drive myself to church and the grocery store. Ask anyone in this neighborhood and they'll tell you the same. And Miss Bennett hesitated, her pen pausing mid-scribble, perhaps not expecting me to sound so clear, so determined. And Robert jumped in quickly, his voice sharp. Mom, don't make this harder than it needs to be. We're just trying to help you transition before something bad happens. But I cut him off, my voice shaking with both fear and fury. You're not trying to help me, Robert. You're trying to erase me while I'm still alive. You're trying to take what your father and I worked for as if I were nothing more than a stepping stone, and I won't let you. And Patricia's face twisted with rage as she hissed, We'll see what the courts have to say about that, before storming out, dragging Robert behind her, leaving the social worker awkwardly mumbling about follow-up visits before she too slipped away. And when the door closed, I collapsed against it, my body trembling from head to toe, because I realized this wasn't just greedy talk anymore. This was war. A war where my own children were preparing to paint me as senile, unstable, unfit, anything to get their hands on this house. And though I wanted to crumble, to sink into despair, I remembered the phone call with Mr. Whitman, the promise he made, and that night I sat at my kitchen table with the lights low, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound, and I dialed his number again, whispering into the receiver through tears. Charles, it's worse than I thought. They're trying to have me declared unfit. Please help me. I can't lose my home. And his steady voice came through the line like a lifeline. Margaret, don't you worry. I've seen children pull these stunts before, but I also know how to stop them. And if they want to fight, they're about to find out just how strong their mother really is. The following week, my attorney Charles Whitman came to the house in his dark gray suit that always seemed to carry authority like a second skin, and when I opened the door and saw him standing there with his leather briefcase, I felt for the first time in weeks that I wasn't completely alone. And as he stepped into Harold's old study, spreading papers across the oak desk, his voice calm and deliberate, he said, Margaret, I want you to listen carefully because what your children are attempting is called guardianship fraud, and it's one of the ugliest tactics families use against their elders. But you are fortunate because Harold left this house in a trust years ago, and unless you voluntarily sign over control, they cannot legally touch it. And the words hit me like a jolt of electricity because I remembered that night, so long ago, when Harold had come home from the lawyer's office with a thick envelope of documents telling me, just in case, Maggie, one day they might not have our best interests at heart. And I had laughed then, brushed it off as Harold's overcautious nature. But now I realized he had been preparing for this very storm. And as Charles explained how the trust protected the deed from being stolen, a new strength swelled inside me, though tears still blurred my eyes, because part of me couldn't stop mourning the fact that such protection was needed against the very children I had raised. But Charles wasn't finished, leaning closer as his voice dropped. What's more, Margaret, your son Robert and his wife Patricia are drowning in debt. I ran some checks after your call, and between credit card balances, a failed business loan, and back taxes, they're desperate, which is why they're pushing so hard to get this house liquidated. They need the money to save themselves. And my chest tightened, because suddenly it all made sense. The urgency in Robert's voice, the venom in Patricia's. They weren't just greedy. They were cornered animals lashing out. And Charles went on, Melissa isn't much better. Her husband Daniel has 3 gambling liens filed against him, and they've already borrowed against her retirement account. So when she showed up here with that lawyer, it wasn't about helping you. It was about keeping their own lives from collapsing. And I sat there trembling, clutching Harold's rosary that hung from the lamp, whispering, how could they? Charles, after everything Harold and I gave them, after every sacrifice, and Charles looked at me with a softness that reminded me why Harold had trusted him. Because desperation rots character, Margaret, but you still have the law, and you still have me. And though my heart felt like glass breaking in 1,000 shards, my mind sharpened, realizing that their betrayal wasn't just cruel, it was calculated. And if I didn't act fast, they would drag me into court, spin stories about confusion and frailty, and try to strip away not just my home, but my very voice. So Charles laid out the plan: medical evaluations to certify my mental soundness, affidavits from neighbors like Clara who saw me drive and shop and manage my home, financial records showing the trust intact, and even security cameras installed around the property to document any further harassment. And as I listened, the despair that had been choking me began to give way to something else, something stronger. A kind of righteous fury I hadn't felt since I was a young woman, marching into the factory to demand fair hours after Harold's accident left him bedridden. And when Charles left that night, clasping my hand firmly and promising, "We'll be ready, Margaret, and when they see what we have, they'll think twice," I walked back into the quiet of my house, sat in Harold's chair, and looked around at the family pictures on the mantel. Melissa in her prom dress, Robert in his baseball uniform, all those innocent smiles that now felt like lies. And I whispered to Harold's photograph, my tears streaming freely. "You were right, love. You always were. They've turned against me, but because of you, because you thought ahead they won't win, I'll make sure of it, even if it breaks my heart to fight my own children. Because if I let them succeed, then everything we built, every meal we skipped, every dollar we saved, it would all be for nothing, and I will not let our legacy end in their greedy hands." The day of the court hearing arrived like a funeral procession, gray skies pressing low over the city, as if the heavens themselves knew a mother was being dragged into battle against her own flesh and blood. And I sat on the hard wooden bench, outside the courtroom, clutching Harold's old pocket watch in my hand, the one he had carried every day of his life, and with each tick I felt him reminding me to stand tall, to be steady. And when the bailiff finally opened the door and called our case, I walked in slowly, my cane clicking against the polished floor, my children already seated at the petitioner's table with smug expressions painted across their faces, Robert in a pressed suit he couldn't afford, Melissa whispering fiercely to her husband Daniel, and Patricia smoothing her designer dress like a queen about to collect her crown. And for a moment my legs trembled because no matter how cruel they had been, those were still my babies. Still the little girl who once begged me to braid her hair for school. Still the boy who used to cry into my apron after striking out at baseball. And the ache of betrayal nearly crushed me until I caught Charles Whitman's steady gaze, his nod giving me the strength to lift my chin as we sat at the defense table. And the judge, an older man with a sharp voice, called the case, in re-guardianship of Margaret Allen, and hearing my own name spoken in that way nearly broke me, as if I were already a relic too frail to make decisions. But I gripped Harold's watch and whispered to myself, "Not today." And then the lies began. Patricia, taking the stand, with a face full of crocodile tears, telling the judge I was forgetful, that I had left the stove on 3 times, that I wandered the neighborhood disoriented, and Melissa adding that I cried constantly, that I couldn't manage finances, that the house was falling apart because I was too weak to maintain it. And Robert, my firstborn, looked the judge in the eye and said with a voice full of false concern, "Your Honor, we love our mother, but she is no longer capable of caring for herself or this property, and we are only trying to make sure she is safe." And every word was like a dagger, each syllable dripping poison into the room, until I thought my heart might burst. But when it was finally my turn, Charles rose, his voice calm but thunderous in its clarity. "Your Honor, before you make any determinations, I have documentation to present. and he laid out the stack of affidavits from my neighbors testifying to my independence, the medical evaluations, signed by 2 doctors affirming my mental clarity, the receipts of every bill paid on time, the photos of my clean, well-kept home, and then, with a dramatic pause that drew every eye in the courtroom, he produced the trust Harold had established decades ago, his steady hand pointing to the clauses that ensured this house could never be sold or transferred without my consent. And the silence that followed was like a crack of lightning, because I watched Patricia's face drain of color, Melissa's jaw tighten, Robert's pen snap in his hand, and Charles wasn't finished. His voice slicing through their lies as he revealed their mountain of debt, the gambling lions, the failed business loan, the back taxes, every secret they thought buried now laid bare under the fluorescent lights. And as the judge flipped through the documents, his eyes narrowing, he turned to my children and said in a voice that made me want to weep with relief, "From what I see here, this woman is not incompetent. She is being preyed upon by her own family, and this court will not allow such abuse to proceed." And though the gavel had not yet fallen, I knew the tide had turned, the smugness gone from their faces replaced with panic. But I did not gloat. I did not smile, because all I could feel was grief that my own children had dragged me here, that strangers had to defend me against the people I once nursed at my breast. And as the judge dismissed their petition with finality, I leaned forward and whispered so softly only Harold's watch could hear, "We won, love." But I never thought victory could feel this heavy. And as I left the courtroom, cane steady in my hand, my children glared at me like enemies vanquished, and in their eyes I saw no shame, only fury, and I knew deep down that though the court had saved my house, the war for my soul and my dignity was not yet finished. I thought the courtroom victory would be the end of it, that after being humiliated in front of the judge and exposed for their lies, my children and their greedy spouses would crawl back into their lives and leave me in peace. But I should have known that desperation doesn't die with a gavel strike. It mutates, it festers, and 3 nights later, I learned just how far they were willing to sink when I woke to the sound of footsteps in my hallway. Soft but hurried, and the creak of a floorboard Harold used to curse because no matter how many times he tried to fix it, it always betrayed a person's weight. And my heart raced as I slipped from my bed, clutching the baseball bat Harold had, kept in the closet since the riots of '68, my body trembling but my mind sharp. And when I flicked on the light, there they were. Robert and Daniel, my son and my son-in-law, caught in the middle of my home with their faces pale and eyes wide, a crowbar in Robert's hand and a backpack slung across Daniel's shoulder. And for a split second I saw the little boy who once asked me to hold him after nightmares. But then I saw the man standing in front of me, ready to ransack his mother's house, and the grief turned to a fire I didn't know I still carried, my voice slicing the silence like a blade. "What are you doing in my home?" And Robert stammered some excuse about looking for documents, while Daniel muttered about just checking on things. But the crowbar glinted under the light, and the truth was louder than their lies, so I raised Harold's bat and, though my knees shook, I stood firm, telling them that I had called Charles earlier in the week and he had advised me to install cameras in every corner, that the police were already on their way, and Robert's face twisted, not with shame, but with rage. "You'll regret this, Mom. You think you've won, but you've just made things worse for yourself." And before I could even answer, red and blue lights flashed through the window, and the sound of sirens filled the night. Neighbors gathering on their porches as officers led my son and his brother-in-law away in handcuffs, their faces dark with fury. And as I stood in the doorway, watching the cars disappear down the street, my whole body shook, not from fear, but from the crushing realization that there was no coming back from this, that the bond between mother and child had been shattered beyond repair. And I wept into the night, whispering to Harold's picture on the mantel, "What did we do wrong, love? How did our children become our enemies?" But even as the grief consumed me, another truth settled like a stone in my chest. I had survived. I had protected our home. I had defended the legacy we built. And though the betrayal cut deeper than any knife, I knew I had to tell this story, so that no other mother would be caught off guard by the ones she trusted most. So, if you are listening to me now, please subscribe, please leave your thoughts in the comments. Tell me if you have faced betrayal in your own family, because the silence is what allows this kind of cruelty to grow. And as I sit here alone in this house that once echoed with laughter, but now trembles with ghosts, I know the war is not truly over, because court cases can return, debts can grow, and greed never sleeps. But I also know that I am not weak, that this old woman still has fire in her. And though my story tonight may end with flashing lights, and the sound of handcuffs closing around my own son's wrists, the real ending has not yet been written. And perhaps that is the cruelest, most haunting part of all, that when your enemies are your own children, peace is never promised. Only vigilance, only the hope that by telling the truth aloud, someone else might be saved from the nightmare of discovering that the hands you once trusted to hold you are the same hands reaching to take everything you have left.